They called him Poppy, George Herbert Walker Bush, 41st President of the United States, a New England aristocrat who became a politician in the Texas oil patch. He owned perhaps the most impressive resume of any man ever to win the White House. He relished the rough and tumble of politics, but steadfastly maintained a public identity of dignified restraint, even in defeat. Tonight, for the first time, you will hear the private thoughts of the 41st president in his own voice, part of an audio diary he kept throughout his presidency. It is a George H.W. Bush who felt things more deeply than he ever let on. I'd like you to hear what he said on the night that he defeated, speaking into his little tape recorder. Your mother asleep in the next room. And these are his reflections.
No, the job is not finished. That kills me. Our kids were absolutely magnificent. Boys telling me, we're proud of you, Dad. We're very proud of you. And I'm thinking, they go back to their communities. Yes, their father was president and all of that, but a failed president.
Your thoughts?
Oh, wow. I never really understood how much the defeat stung him because he kept it hidden. He bottled up this sense of defeat.
The loss his father felt, the younger Bush says, was not just his defeat by Bill Clinton, but something deeper.
Dad really didn't accept the baby boomer view of duty and honor. And therefore, to be beaten by the first baby boomer president was upsetting to him.
George Herbert Walker Bush was born on June 12, 1924, in Milton, Massachusetts, to a patrician family with high expectations and a firm sense of public duty. His father, Prescott, was a serious and forceful figure who would become a United States Senator. His mother, Dorothy, taught her son to strive for excellence, but never to show off while doing so.
One of the famous stories in our family, you go in and say, you know, Mom, I hit a home run. And she looked at him and said, well, how'd the team do?
In his teens, Bush went to prep school at Andover, where he showed he was a natural leader at sports and student affairs. As he was preparing for Yale in the family tradition, the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor. Bush knew what he had to do.
I volunteered on June 12th, 1942. That was my 18th birthday. I knew I wanted to be a pilot, and that was the first day you could be enlisted.
Bush began flying dangerous missions over the Pacific before the age of 20.
I got shot down one time, September 2nd, 1944. We were making a final strike on the Bonin Islands. I felt this jolt. I could see the fire all around, anti-aircraft, and then suddenly my plane was on fire.
Bush tried to save his crew, but 2 men died. He ended up in the Pacific Ocean, spending 4 hours on a life raft before this footage was taken of his rescue by an American submarine.
Thank God. You really do. You know, in that life raft, you go right back to the fundamental values. I was 20 years old. You think of family, and you think of faith, you pray.
When he returned from the war, Bush resumed his courtship of Barbara Pierce. He had met her when she was 16, and he'd proposed to her just before leaving for the Pacific. They were married on January 6, 1945. Life was returning to normal. Bush attended Yale, where he got into an accelerated program, and in 1948 graduated as a member of Phi Beta Kappa with a degree in economics. He had a job waiting for him in the family investment business, but he didn't take the easy path.
He didn't rely on family connections or wealth.
Neil Bush is the third of 4 sons of George H.W. Bush.
He did something pretty remarkable when he was a young man after coming back from war and graduated from Yale. He packed up on a red Studebaker and went to West Texas, which is about as far from civilization as you can get if you're a Greenwich, Connecticut-raised, New York City-bound young professional.
Bush was just 24 years old. Your dad is a Yankee aristocrat.
Correct.
To his core.
Correct. You got to ask the question, what caused him to leave his roots and a family he adores to move out to West Texas? And it was this sense of adventure. He's an adventuresome person. But Dad could relate to people from all walks of life. And he didn't act Texan. He never wore a cowboy hat and a big belt buckle and cowboy boots, but nevertheless, became a part of the Midland scene.
In 1953, tragedy. His 3-year-old daughter, Robin, was diagnosed with leukemia. She died just 3 months later.
It was devastating. One of the defining tragedies of their lives.
The Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham was given unprecedented access to the Bush family archives.
He wrote a letter in the late 1950s to his mother about Robin. There is about our house a need, the running, pulsating restlessness of the 4 boys as they struggle to learn and grow. We need some soft blonde hair to offset those crew cuts. We need a dollhouse to stand firm against our forts and rackets and 1,000 baseball cards. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once. We need her, and yet we have her. We can't touch her, and yet we can feel her. We hope she'll stay in our house for a long, long time. Love, Pop. When I asked the president to read that letter out loud in an interview, he broke down long before he finished, sobbing very hard. And his chief of staff came in the room and said, "Well, why did you want him to do that?" And I said, "Well, if you want to know someone's heart," and before I could finish the sentence, the president said, "You have to know what breaks it."
Such deeply personal insights are what moved Meacham to write Destiny and Power, a new biography of George H.W. Bush. Among the material he drew from was a trove of the former president's private audio diaries, which we will hear much more of later.
I first met President Bush in 1998, and I remember thinking even then, 17 years ago, that George Bush was a much more complicated and interesting figure than most people might think. I was looking at this as his story and his times about this remarkable life, decade after decade of service. And I really believe that he was the last of a kind.
The same year Bush lost his daughter, he co-founded the oil company Zapata Petroleum.
In Texas, he finds the most adventurous possible element of that business and becomes an offshore oil man.
Bush, now the father of 4 boys and the young girl he had longed for since Robin's tragic death, wanted to serve his country in the political arena. His father, Prescott, had become a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, and now George, in 1964, ran for that same office in Texas.
George Bush, the happy family man, is now George Bush, Republican candidate for the United States Senate.
He lost his Senate race. Not one to give up, he ran for the House of Representatives in 1966 and won.
One of the extraordinary things about Bush is he was almost immediately thought of in national terms the moment he got to Washington as a member of the House.
Among those who saw big things for Bush was President Richard Nixon.
Nixon was a vital patron. Made him ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee.
But it was a bad time to be chairman. The GOP was falling apart amid the Watergate scandal. Nixon resigned in 1974 and Ford took his place. Ford named Bush envoy to China and then director of the CIA.
When he was offered the CIA, public confidence in the agency was at a low. But he had this intense belief that a citizen's duty was to do what the President of the United States asked you to do.
CIA was a significant problem for us. We'd just been through a situation where there were questions about the way the agency had been handled, about some of the programs that had been carried on. So it was an important time when there was a lot going on, and as we put all those pieces together, George Bush ended up at CIA.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
After Democrat Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, Bush retreated to Texas to figure out what to do next. His decision? Swing for the fences. He would run for president.
They break out laughing after you tell them you're running for president of the United States.
Nice to meet you.
He went into Iowa and he met everyone he could possibly meet. And he upsets Reagan. He announces that he has the big mo, the momentum, and this is going to knock Reagan out. He didn't count on one thing, which is Ronald Reagan. And Reagan comes back strong and knocks Bush out.
It looked like it could be the end of George Bush's political career. He had not exactly been tough on Reagan, but he did say this.
He's promising to cut taxes by 30% and balance the budget and increase defense spending and stop inflation all at the same time. It just isn't going to work. What I call a voodoo economic policy.
But at the convention, Reagan chose him as his running mate.
Reagan made the decision himself, ultimately, to turn to Bush.
Bush had wanted to lead, but he knew how to be a good team player.
Bush was the quintessential perfect vice president for Ronald Reagan. He never once articulated a view or feeling or a policy that was at odds with the president, and they became extraordinarily close, very, very good friends, and an extremely good team.
As Ronald Reagan's second term was drawing to a close, Bush was ready for the biggest moment of his life. But while you'd expect the second in command of a popular president to have an easy path to the nomination, his quest turned out to be anything but that.
Let's.
I will be president of the United States. Today at noon is 72 hours away. Time is clicking.
For most of his political life, Bush had been aiming for the White House. He knew his last chance was to win in 1988.
8 years ago, I stood here with Ronald Reagan, and we promised together to break with the past and return America to her greatness.
Early on in his campaign, Bush sometimes seemed unfocused, and voters weren't sure what he stood for.
When he would be asked why he wanted to be president, there weren't always crisp answers. With Ronald Reagan, it was cut taxes and defeat communism. Bush had a broader view. He was not a campaigner whose style lent itself to sound bites, and that hurt him.
Conservatives weren't sure he was one of them.
He was a conservative in the sense that he wanted to conserve what was best about the country and reform what wasn't. And that reform would take the shape of sensible, often centrist solutions. President Bush really believed that if he was trying to do the right thing, if his heart was in the right place, and if he produced results, then the voters would be with him.
On top of all this, there was the so-called wimp factor, an appellation given him by an October 1987 Newsweek cover.
Drove Bush bananas, called it an ugly, nasty political shot, and was asked about it again and again and again. Some people seemed to doubt whether he had the strength and the guts to make the hard call. Bush's argument was, well, you know what? The men I flew in war with didn't think that. The men I built a business with didn't think that. The CIA agents I served with didn't think that. Ronald Reagan doesn't think that.
One incident that helped dispel that notion was when he stood up for himself during a testy exchange with Dan Rather.
It's not fair to judge my whole career by a rehash on Iran. How would you like it if I judged your career by those 7 minutes when you walked off the set in New York? Well, now, would you like that?
Mr.
I
Vice
have
President,
respect for you, but I don't have respect for what you're doing here tonight.
It was a moment that he really created a sense of emotion amongst his supporters. I thought it was wonderful. But it's interesting of George Bush that he expressed doubt. You know, you think it went okay, yeah, it went okay. It went better than okay.
Bush won the nomination by getting tough with his Republican competitors.
Bush went negative. Bush won the primary in New Hampshire and then won in South Carolina and pressed on to victory ultimately.
His first big decision as nominee was to pick a running mate. Bush chose a relative unknown, the 41-year-old senator from Indiana, Dan Quayle.
George Bush made the official offer, and I said, oh, thank you very much. We'll be a great team. And he says, we want to keep it a surprise, so don't tell anybody. I said, well, surprise. I said, I'm sort of watching television, and they've just said it's not Dole and it's not Kemp. I think they might figure out fairly soon that it might be me. And he said, look, this is your first assignment. Now don't screw it up.
I'm proud to have Dan Quayle at my side.
Bush wanted a surprise. He wanted to be, as he put it, bold and generational. The Quayle decision was the first decision that Bush had really been able to make in a totally independent way since he went on the ticket with Reagan 8 years before.
The big moment at the convention was Bush's acceptance speech. Here at last was a chance to define himself in front of the whole nation.
I want a kinder and gentler nation.
The speech in New Orleans, I think, made him in many ways. And what was so remarkable about New Orleans was he delivered this speech with power and conviction.
This is my mission, and I will complete it.
And he used something he didn't like using, which was the first person pronoun. He said, I am that man.
There was one line in the speech that would be remembered above all the others.
Read my lips.
He decided to say it. He paid a price for it forever.
Bush had redefined himself, and now he sought to define Michael Dukakis.
I remember that we were 18 points behind.
He attacked his opponent over many issues, but most memorably over a prison furlough release program in Massachusetts.
His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. While out, many committed other crimes like kidnapping and rape, and many are still at large.
Governor Dukakis had kept the furlough program alive.
It really became the symbol of, first, Dukakis's permissiveness on the furlough program, and then in retrospect, as the years have gone by, it's become a symbol of the negativity, the alleged negativity of that campaign.
Many called the campaign one of the nastiest ever, but the strategy was working, and Bush was gaining on Dukakis. Bush went on to a solid victory, gaining 53.4% of the popular vote, an amount no president, Republican or Democrat, has gotten since. Only a few days before he took office, he privately took stock of himself and his plans.
The deficit looms horrendous. There's no easy answer. To be kind and gentle, we can't double the money. I've got to do the personal things to keep the Congress from killing me. I got to reach and say, out and say, here's what I want to do. And I know you don't like it. But what do you think we ought to do?
Again.
All presidents see pivotal world events, but there may have been no more momentous period in the last century than the years George H.W. Bush was in office.
So far, it's only self-business. I feel comfortable in the job. I'm quite used to being called Mr. President. Went to the Oval Office, and everything was changed overnight, quick. Reagan was gone, Bush was in.
George Bush was his own man, and he did things particularly, I think, in the foreign policy sphere that were somewhat different, perhaps, than might have happened under President Reagan.
One thing he knew he'd have to deal with from the start, the Cold War, which had been the central fact of American foreign policy for decades. But as Bush took office, something was happening overseas. There appeared to be tears in the Iron Curtain. In Eastern Europe, borders long closed by communism were opening up. Then in November, the unthinkable happened. The symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, fell. It was a great moment, but a dangerous one too. How would Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, react to the dissolution of its empire?
Bush insists that he will handle it with grace and with dignity, He won't, as he put it, stick it in Gorbachev's eye. Gorbachev later said that Bush's controlled reaction to the fall of the wall helped him avoid a hardliner counter-reaction in Europe. He's able to put himself in the shoes of the hardliners and think, how would I feel if I felt my system, my world crumbling? Well, I would not want the other side to dance on the wall. So he refuses to do it.
I was a little more forward-leaning than the president was, I think, in terms of my desire to make certain that the process continued and do as quickly as possible. And the president clearly led the effort.
I remember very distinctly, he says, we will not be bragging. We will not be out there flexing our muscle. We've got to be quiet. I've talked to Thatcher, I've talked to Kohl, I've talked to Mitterrand, and we're going to downplay this and let it just play out. We're going to do this in a quiet, diplomatic way. And he's very firm about that from the very beginning.
I remember the criticism that George Bush got when he refused to dance on the ruins of the Berlin Wall. They said, you've won this 40-year conflict, and you're not showing any emotion. What's wrong with you? And he understood that we still had a lot of business to do with Gorbachev, and we weren't going to stick it in their eye.
He pays a political price at home. He has Democrats in Congress. He has others saying, you know, that he didn't understand the historical moment. That's just crazy. Nobody understood the historical moment of the Berlin Wall falling more than George Herbert Walker Bush.
I thought he did a good job of managing America's role in the aftermath of the Berlin Wall, the end of the communist system, giving us a chance to have a positive relationship with both a united Germany and a united Europe on the one hand, and hopefully a democratic and more peaceful Russia. He maximized the chances of a good outcome with the decisions he made.
The potential for chaos and the potential for the United States mismanaging that, the potential for us to see this as a moment of extraordinary weakness in an arch enemy, and to push as hard as we could. All those temptations were there, and I think that the Bush administration understood that for us to be able to reimagine Europe and reimagine the world was going to require restraint and care, and the way the president managed that was really important, and his national security team helped to usher in relatively peacefully a transition to what we now know as a unified Europe, and purchased at least 25 years of relative stability and peace in relations between the United States and Russia.
The Soviet Union fell without anyone firing a shot. But before the 41st president's time in office was over, he would go to war and be tested as he never had been before. George H.W. Bush had served in the military, but before his years in office were over, he'd have to show that he could lead the military into battle as well.
I'm heading back to Washington. It's been probably the most hectic 48 hours since I've been president in terms of serious national security interests. I've been on the phone incessantly and have written down a long collection of names. The bottom line is that the West is together.
It was the most hectic 48 hours for President Bush because just days earlier, the forces of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded and occupied their tiny neighbor Kuwait. It was a defining moment for the post-Cold War era. Bush led the world's only superpower, but instead of intervening alone, he reached out to the rest of the world.
He knew foreign policy. He understood it. He'd practiced it. He knew a lot of these people from prior iterations.
Some of his friends in the region were reluctant allies.
I've been afraid some of them would peel off and support a puppet regime. One of the worst offenders has been my friend King Hussein, who is simply out there apologizing for Saddam Hussein and being almost a spokesman for him. He told me he wanted an Arab solution. So did Mubarak. Both of them are in the hand-wringing stage. The bottom line is a lot of these Arab countries are scared to death of Saddam Hussein.
We had a number of the Arab countries, which we thought was very important to be part of the coalition. The Arab countries' demand was that we not invade Iraq and that we not target Saddam specifically. And we basically said, we're not going to invade Iraq. That's not our objective. Our objective is to get him out of Kuwait.
The most serious problem that I have faced as president, because the downside is so enormous, something that could have the magnitude of a new world war with so many countries involved. Fortunately, the Soviets have been on the right side of all of this.
Had the Soviets not come on board right after the invasion, we never would have been able to build the coalition that we ultimately, and we would never have gotten a resolution out of the Security Council because they would have vetoed it. People talk a lot about building coalitions. We're talking about a coalition in Syria today. Well, it's not, you know, it isn't there. Others have talked about coalition, but the only one that really was a strong, substantial, functioning, overwhelming coalition was this one that President Bush built to eject Iraq from Kuwait.
This is a guy who's had been through World War II. And that whole generation that all been veterans of World War II and remembered very much what it was like, but also were strong believers in using American force when necessary. So when we reached a particular point, the president was there, and I think we all agreed with him that it was time to go clean out the house.
The decision to go to war was not taken lightly. I want you to hear recordings your dad made from Christmas Eve, 1990. Of course, that's right before the start of the Gulf War.
It's Christmas Eve. You think of the families, loved ones apart. I read 10 or 15 letters, all of them saying, take care of my kid. Some saying, please don't shoot. Some saying it's not worth dying for gasoline. And on it goes. But the cry is, save my boy. Then I sit here knowing that if there is no movement on Saddam's part, we have to go to war.
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised he carried a burden about the decision. After all, he had seen war. He'd lost a lot of his friends. He still talks about the two men that died when his plane got shot over the island of Chichijimi. Secondly, he had already committed troops once into Panama, and there had been loss of life, and I can remember him dealing with the anguish he felt. So I'm not surprised that he deliberated over the decision. On the other hand, George Bush is the kind of person who, when he says something, means it, and he meant it.
January 15th, about to go to work. I'm troubled about how this ends. I hope the air is so devastating that it will bring Saddam to his knees. But then what? How do you quit? How do we get his million-man army to leave their weapons and go back to their villages?
When you listen to those tapes, you're really listening to a man grappling with the most important problems of the modern age.
I've never felt a day like this in my life. I'm very tired. I didn't sleep well. This troubles me because I must go to the nation at 9 o'clock. My lower gut hurts, nothing like when I had the bleeding ulcer. But I'm aware of it, and I take a couple of Mylantas. My mind is 1,000 miles away. I simply can't sleep. I think of what other presidents went through. The agony of war. I Think of our able pilots, their training, their gung-ho spirit, and also what it is they're being asked to do.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Tonight, as our forces fight, they and their families are in our prayers. May God bless each and every one of them and the coalition forces at our side in the Gulf, and may He continue to bless our nation, the United States of America.
Well, it's now 10:45 at night, and I'm about to go to bed. I did my speech to the nation at 9 o'clock. I didn't feel nervous about it at all. I knew what I wanted to say, and I said it, and I hope it resonates.
Operation Desert Storm, with a coalition of 34 nations, lasted 6 weeks. Iraq was driven from Kuwait. It was a decisive victory.
What we and our coalition partners did to stand up against Saddam Hussein's aggression was right, it was just, it was moral, and we did the right thing.
It was over in relatively quick order. It was necessary. It was the right thing to do. And it marked sort of a whole new phase in international affairs, because clearly the United States was the sole power left.
The only question remaining was whether U.S. forces should remove Saddam Hussein.
It was the right thing to do. They didn't know what would happen if Saddam were gone, but they were pretty sure it wouldn't be a walk in the park. He said he wouldn't do it, and he kept his word.
People used to ask us all the time, why didn't you guys go to Baghdad and take care of Saddam when you had the chance? Well, guess what? Nobody asks us that anymore, because they now see why we didn't. Because of the ethnic tensions and conflicts that would have resulted, which have resulted. And it was a very wise decision. We would have lost our coalition, and it was the right decision to make, as history has now shown us.
Baker's assessment is a subtle dig at the conduct of the Second Gulf War as waged by the second Bush administration. The elder Bush was not so subtle when talking to biographer Meacham. He thought his son's Vice President, Dick Cheney, and his Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, were unreflective hawks. Rumsfeld particularly chafed the elder Bush, who said of Rumsfeld, quote, "I don't like what he did, and I think it hurt the president, having his iron-ass view of everything." After the Gulf War, President Bush had a near 90% approval rating, but he would discover that in politics, as in physics, what goes up must come down.
WeatherTech. Order your WeatherTech gift card today at WeatherTech.com.
You gotta see it.
Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays from WeatherTech.
In foreign affairs, Bush was flying high. It was on the domestic side where his presidency came crashing down.
And now I sign legislation which takes a sledgehammer to another wall, one which has, for too many generations, separated Americans with disabilities from the freedom they could glimpse but not grasp.
He passes sweeping civil rights legislation with the Americans with Disabilities Act. He passes the Clean Air Act, which is still basically our environmental policy. He does things trying to make the bills as conservative as possible, but which were in fact bills that involved a big role for the public sector. How did he justify it? He justified it because he thought that was what was right for the country. And the politics of it, the politics of explaining what he was doing, was never his strong suit.
That domestic agenda got him in trouble with the conservative wing of his party.
This bill ought to be retitled and called the Lawyers Relief Act of 1989, because there's going to be a lot of people in law offices and a lot of people in the federal courts.
But the biggest domestic issue, and one that ended up hurting Bush the most, was the economy. Bush had promised no new taxes, but he knew from the start of his presidency, with a growing deficit, they might be necessary. President Bush did not like revoking his pledge.
He believed it was a breach of his word, and he took that very seriously.
But he felt Congress had him over a barrel. Ultimately, he gave in. The budget passed in late 1990 included tax hikes.
To get a budget through, he did what was politically very much of a negative to him in agreeing with the Democrat Congress to raise revenues to get the spending cuts.
In my view, it was a mistake to raise them, having made it such a high-profile promise or commitment. I understand full well why he did it. We were running huge deficits. There was he negotiated a deal with congressional Democrats under which he would agree to some tax increases in exchange for spending cuts.
It's hard to remember now, but the deficit at that time was really seen as an existential issue. It was about American decline. It was about our capacity to project power around the world. And getting the deficit under control was a central political priority.
Raising taxes angered his base.
His sense of duty, his sense of putting the country first, was that he would take the political hit that was required, but he was not going to shut the government down in October and November of 1990 as troops are streaming into the Middle East.
He always says, Dan, he says, I'm going to be judged by the results. I'm going to be judged by the decisions I make. And if I make the correct decisions, the American people are going to reward me.
He'd been the most popular president of the modern era. Yet, was he destined to be a one-termer? Heading into his re-election bid, President Bush seemed such a shoo-in that the marquee Democrats shied away from the race. But the 1992 election was packed with surprise and presented a choice, not just between men, but between generations. After the successful prosecution of Desert Storm,
and normal business with respect to the budget, tax policy, and so forth. And it was a complete switch. The public moved back away from the war. They were concerned about their own situations and domestic issues, which isn't surprising.
There's a lot of people at work, and there's an unsatisfactory number of people out of work.
By the summer of 1992, Bush's approval rating had tanked down to 29%. And then came a cascade of unfortunate publicity. At a routine photo op, an encounter with a supermarket scanner that made him seem out of touch. And on a trip abroad, he threw up at a state dinner.
Well, he got sick in Japan. He had the stomach flu, threw up on the Prime Minister of Japan. It was a symbol that things weren't going well.
In the Republican primaries, Bush would stave off a challenge from the right by Pat Buchanan and ultimately win his party's nomination. But there was doubt in the air. His Democratic opponent, Bill Clinton, was his polar opposite. Bush was from the greatest generation, Clinton a baby boomer. Bush served his country, Clinton avoided the draft. And Bush's political style was of another era.
He was not comfortable with the confessional politics that was taking shape. The idea that he would say, I feel your pain, is impossible.
I feel your pain. I feel your pain.
Clinton was confessional. Clinton was, I'm one of you. Bush was, I can lead you. And that's a fundamental distinction. It's a generational distinction.
Worse for Bush, third-party candidate Ross Perot was polling well and wouldn't go away. Clinton won the election with 43% of the vote. Bush got 37.5%, and Perot a surprising 19%.
Without Perot, I'm convinced that we would have been reelected by a fairly significant margin.
George Bush was now officially a one-term president.
I just called Governor Clinton over in Little Rock and offered my congratulations. He did run a strong campaign. I wish him well in the White House.
While he maintained a stoic facade, on election night, he was aching.
It's 12:15 Central Standard Time on the night he lost the presidency of the United States. He is in Suite 271 of the Houstonian Hotel and begins to dictate.
Hurt. I guess I have the pride, too. I don't like to be a failed president. To quote, the failed presidency of George Bush, unquote. And on a competitive basis, I don't like to see the pollsters right at the end. I don't like to see the That's right. I don't like to see all those who have written me off right. I was absolutely convinced we'd prove them wrong. But I was wrong, and they were right, and that hurts a lot.
You had to design somebody to be Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States. You'd be hard put to find anybody who was as qualified as President Bush was.
Need a couple of days to get past this. I'll have no trouble once we get to the Hill. Once the pomp and the ceremony, and I have no feelings other than to wish our new president well.
Yes, he did that. And he also, you know, every departing president leaves his successor a note. And the note he wrote me, which I treasure, said exactly that. That it was the most wonderful opportunity in the world. He wished me well. He wished our country well. And I think that's pretty much what his life's been about.
What an experience it's been. How privileged I am. How lucky our family has been. How much I miss my mother. And today I'm thinking of Dad, too. As I told Bill Clinton, I feel the same sense of wonder, majesty about this office today as I did when I first walked in here. I've tried to keep it. Tried to serve here with no taint of dishonor, no conflict of interest, nothing to sully this beautiful place, this job I've been privileged to hold. It's amazing. This is my last day as President of the United States of America.
Thomas Jefferson once said, "No man will ever carry out of the presidency the reputation which carried him into it." That seems to be true of George H.W. Bush, whose standing was at low ebb when he was voted out of office. But reputation is a funny thing. The further away we get from the Bush presidency, and the more perspective we have, the better it looks.
George Bush was an incredible leader. He led by making decisions, tough decisions, good decisions. He was a results-oriented president.
When he took the oath of office on Friday, January 20th, 1989, nuclear Armageddon was a possibility. And when he left office, it was not. Not a bad record, that.
He went out of his way to show respect to other humans, whether they were Americans or in his diplomatic work or as president. You know, he was extraordinary in showing humility, through humility in leading.
I argue he's the great one-term president in the nation's history.
He had principles, but he also had common sense. And when you look at both how he managed foreign policy and when you think about how he handled domestic policy, in each case he was thoughtful, restrained, and made good decisions. And I think that ultimately he was one of the more underrated presidents that we've ever had, certainly in modern times.
He's a gentleman's gentleman. He's a patriot.
I genuinely love the guy because of the feelings he has for his family, because he is an innately kind person in his interpersonal relations, and because I think he really did want the best for the country.
He's my best friend, and he says I'm his, and that's a big deal for me.
We had an honest administration. There was no scandals. And we put the country first and hope that's what the legacy will be.